True crime is everywhere. Podcasts, docuseries, dramatizations, streaming exclusives. The genre dominates contemporary media. And yet, for all its ubiquity, very few works in the space transcends the lure of spectacle. Too often, true crime reduces tragedy to entertainment, flattening complexity into digestible bits of good versus evil. In 2022, Netflix released The Good Nurse, a film that resisted this trend. Directed by Tobias Lindholm, with a screenplay by Christy Wilson Cairns and performances from Jessica Chastain and Redmayne, a true crime story that is less about sensationalism than about the systems, less about horror than about complicity, and less about the criminal than about the fragile courage required to stop him. The film is based on the shocking real case of Charles Cullen, a nurse who murdered dozens and possibly hundreds patients across multiple hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania over a 16-year career. The scale of his crimes makes him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But rather than dramatizing Cullen's violence directly, the film centers on Amy Loughren, a fellow nurse who worked alongside Cullen and eventually risked her own health, safety, and livelihood to expose him. In doing so, The Good Nurse reframes the genre. It is not a film about how evil operates in the shadows, but about how ordinary systems enable that evil to thrive in plain sight. This video examined The Good Nurse in depth, its character studies, its institutional critique, its ethical stakes, and its cinematic form. We will ask what it means to portray evil not as a monster exception, but as a normal routine, and what it means for a film to place care, empathy, and moral responsibility at its center. Ultimately, I will argue that The Good Nurse is not only one of the most unsettling true crime films of recent years, but also one of the most politically urgent. At the heart of The Good Nurse is Amy Loughren, played by a quiet intensity by Jessica Chastain. Amy is a single mother, working grueling night shifts in the ICU, while secretly managing a life-threatening heart condition she cannot afford to treat. Amy embodies the contradictions of contemporary American healthcare. She is overworked, underpaid, uninsured, and yet tasked with providing life-saving care to others. But Amy is not portrayed as a saint or an archetype of self-sacrifice. Instead, the film emphasizes her vulnerability. Her fatigue is visible, her pain is constant, her exhaustion permeates every scene, and yet it is precisely through this vulnerability that her strength emerges. Unlike the faceless administrators who prioritize liability over lives, she knows what it means to be fragile, and therefore she recognizes the fragility in others. This is crucial to the narrative because it positions Amy as the opposite to Charles Cullen. Where he is detached, she is empathetic. Where he hides behind silence, she engages through care. Where he exploits the vulnerabilities of patients, she exposes her own vulnerability as a means of connection. In doing so, The Good Nurse makes a radical claim that empathy, often dismissed as weakness, can in fact be a source of immense moral power. If Amy represents care, Charles Cullen represents its inversion. Eddie Redmayne delivers one of the most chillingly understated performances in recent memory. Cullen is not portrayed as a charismatic monster or a flamboyant killer. Instead, he is quiet, awkward, withdrawn. He blends in. And that is precisely what makes him terrifying. The film draws on Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil. The idea that the greatest horror often emerges not from the dramatic villainy but from the ordinary. Cullen is not a figure of gothic excess. He is, instead, the co-worker who helps with paperwork, the colleague who offers rides home, the friend who babysits your kids. He kills not in moments of spectacle, but through the routine act of injecting insulin and digoxin into IV bags. Evil becomes inseparable from the ordinary fabric of hospital life. This dullness is what allowed Cullen to evade detection for so long. He did not operate outside the systems, but within it, exploiting its blind spots, benefiting from its silence, and moving from hospital to hospital as institutions quietly dismiss him rather than confronting liability. In the absence of spectacle, we are forced to confront a far more unsettling truth, that horror can sometimes look like kindness. Perhaps the most radical element of The Good Nurse is its refusal to treat Cullen's murders as the product of one man alone. The film shows how hospitals, administrators, and healthcare systems enabled his crimes. When suspicion arose, hospitals did not contact police. Instead, they quietly fired Cullen, provided neutral references, and passed him on the next institution. Why? Because acknowledging the crimes would expose them to lawsuits, liability, and financial loss. Patient safety was consistently subordinated to profit margins. This is where The Good Nurse transcends the boundaries of true crime. It is not only a story about a killer, but a story about capitalism. The healthcare system, in its for-profit structure, is shown as structurally complicit. Administrators are less concerned with justice than with risk management. The film carefully depicts their evasive language. We follow protocol, there's no conclusive evidence, as shields against accountability. Cullen did not simply slip through the cracks. The cracks were engineered by a system designed to prioritize institutional self-protection over human life. In highlighting this complicity, the film makes a broader critique of neoliberal healthcare. The very system meant to preserve life becomes one that facilitates death. It is a damning portrait not only of Cullen's crimes, but of the conditions that allow those crimes to continue for nearly 2 decades. One of the most unsettling dynamics in The Good Nurse is the friendship between Amy and Charles. Early in the film, Cullen is portrayed as supportive. He helps Amy with her workload, covers for her when she struggles, and even cares for her children. For Amy, isolated by exhaustion and illness, this companionship is life-saving, but this intimacy becomes the very ground of betrayal. When Amy realized the truth, the shock is not only that her friend is a murderer, but that he exploited her trust to continue the killing. This relationship is central to the film's emotional power. It forces us to reckon with the ambiguity of intimacy, how trust can nurture but also endanger, how closeness can be weaponized. Amy's courage is not simply in exposing Cullen, but in confronting the unbearable fact that the person who helped her survive was simultaneously destroying the lives of others. Tobias Lindholm's direction is defined by restraint. The cinematography is muted, the color palette cold, the pacing deliberate. There are no dramatized murder scenes, no sensationalized violence. Instead, the horror emerges from atmosphere, the sterile corridors of the hospital, the quiet beeping of machines, the exhaustion shown on faces. This subdued aesthetic reflects on the film's thematic concerns. Evil here is not dramatic but ordinary. The style mirrors the banality of the crimes themselves. Equally significant is the film's commitment to realism. The dialogue is understated, the performance naturalistic, the settings grounded. This realism refuses the distancing comfort of genre stylization. Instead, it confronts the audience with the unsettling truth that these events did happen, and they happen not in cinematic darkness. The horror is precisely that it looks so ordinary. Adapting real tragedies always raises ethical questions. How does one tell a story about real victims without reducing their suffering to spectacle? The Good Nurse approaches this challenge with care. It refuses to sensationalize Cullen's violence. The focus remains on Amy's perspective, emphasizing not voyeurism but moral responsibility. This ethical restraint differentiates the film from much of the true crime genre, which often exploits trauma for entertainment. Instead, The Good Nurse honors the victims by interrogating the system that failed them and foregrounding the bravery of the nurse who sought justice in their name. At its core, The Good Nurse is about care. Care as labor, care as empathy, care as moral responsibility. Amy represents the possibility of care even with a system that devalues it. Cullen represents its betrayal, the conversion of healing into harm, and the hospital represent neglect, institutions that could have cared but chose not to. These three forces, care, betrayal, neglect, form the film's moral architecture. By framing the story this way, The Good Nurse invites us to reflect on a broader cultural question. What does it mean to live in a society where systems of care are subordinated to systems of profit? What does it mean when individuals like Amy must risk their own lives to do what institutions refuse to do? And what does it reveal about us, as audiences, that we are both horrified by Cullen's crimes and unsurprised by the institution's complicity? The Good Nurse is not a relaxing film. It refuses catharsis, it denies spectacle, and it confronts us with an unsettling truth, that evil is not always extraordinary. Sometimes it is quiet, normal, and facilitated by the very systems meant to prevent it. But it is also about a film about courage. The courage of a single mother who, despite exhaustion, illness, and fear, chose to act when no one else would. In doing so, Amy Loughren reminds us that moral responsibility is not the absence of vulnerability, but the willingness to act through it. As true crime continues to dominate popular culture, The Good Nurse stands as a rare example of what the genre can achieve when handled with seriousness and care. It is not about a film about death alone, but about the conditions of life, the need for empathy, the danger of neglect, and the possibility of justice. In a cultural moment saturated with stories of violence, The Good Nurse asks us to look not only the killer, but ourselves, our systems, and the values we choose to uphold.